Hello and welcome back to The Driven Wheel. Today we're going to be having a look at my BMW R100, taking it for a spin and discussing both its good and its bad points. So this one was built in 1978 and it belonged to the best man at my parents' wedding, and when he gave up riding I just couldn't not have it. Now, this review is going to be quite detailed. We're going to be diving into some of the technology on the bike and discussing its less than perfect handling and the reasons behind it. So if you own one of these, then don't be offended, but do be realistic. This is a bike from the 1970s, and if it were perfect, it quite frankly wouldn't be half as charming. So like all Boxer engines, this is smooth and well balanced when everything's adjusted correctly. When I got this one, it was fairly rough, so I had the cylinder heads resurfaced and the valves lapped in properly. This cost about 60 quid a head, and it tends to be money well spent with old bikes and cars. It gives you confidence that everything's sealing properly and working as it should. This, coupled with getting the carbs set up correctly, transformed this bike from being very lumpy at certain revs into being a smooth and linear engine. Now, I hadn't balanced bin carbs like this before, and it took me a few goes to get it right and understand why it needed to be adjusted in a certain way, so I'm sorry if I'm teaching you to suck eggs. Idle balance is set conventionally with screws, but the separate throttle cables need to be adjusted as well. Otherwise, the slides rise at different rates, causing pronounced lumpiness. Now, there are various techniques and their exponents online, but using a conventional vacuum gauge worked fine for me. It isn't rocket science after all. As a side note, I really like these bin carburetors. They're infinitely more sophisticated than the Amals fitted to British bikes of the period. They allow full throttle from low revs without the associated flat spots and bogging, which is the downside of pure slide carburetors. One thing I do remain unconvinced on is I've changed the valve covers for the earlier types, because in my eyes they're prettier. The issue here is that valve train clatter is far more pronounced with these fitted, to the point where if you weren't used to old bikes, you're going to wonder if you've adjusted the valves correctly. Couple this with the fact that one side always seems noisier than the other, and it might make you worry. You shouldn't though. These are mechanically a bit noisy, but it never gets worse, and the engine runs happily hot or cold. The original owner fitted a Boyer Branson electronic ignition, which is still working great many years later. Now, I have had the experience on Triumph twins of the box eventually failing, but I'd speculate that's perhaps due to significantly increased vibration on those bikes. I do think if I were going to do a long European tour, and knowing how old it is, I'd probably acquire a spare before leaving, just in case. Starting from cold is easy with a healthy dose of choke, but even with a new battery fitted, I do feel the starter could spin faster. This does seem to be a trait of all Boxers of this age, and it's never failed to start. On the road, it's a wonderfully relaxed engine to use. Unlike most manufacturers' claim brake horsepower figures, I actually believe BMW in this case. 60 horsepower thumps you down the road with some sense of urgency, and in third or fourth, it's a competent overtaker. Its performance is something which has surprised me. It's easy to be spoiled by modern stuff and forget just how usable this level of power really is on the road. Lastly, this really is one of the great motorbike engine noises. It's so distinctive and clear. It really is a great noise. Now let's talk about the famed BMW gearbox. To this day they struggle a bit with refinement. This one is passable from a 70s bike perspective, but the British and the Japanese were certainly doing it better. The bike gives a shudder and a bang whenever you engage first. After that, first through third are smooth. Fourth and fifth are both more likely to result in a neutral first time, until you figure out how to ride around it. There are several techniques. Keeping your foot pressure on the lever as you release the clutch helps, as does getting a feel for the weird two-stage way in which gears engage. It's perfectly rideable like this, but false neutrals are always there to catch out the unwary. The single plate dry clutch tends toward the grabby, and here it's very abrupt in its engagement. You get used to it, and there are various fixes, including greasing splines and cables. It's better than when I got it, but it's not easy to engage it smoothly. Fortunately, its tractor-like torque means you can run in second gear right the way down to walking pace without slipping the clutch, and this helps enormously with town riding. Now, it's important to say that all these bikes are different and all have been treated differently over the course of their lives. This is obviously going to affect how they feel today, and some may be better or worse than this one. Right then, onto the handling, and this is where it gets fun. Have you ever watched one of those old wobble and weave videos on YouTube? Well, there's a very good reason why they often feature BMWs. When I first got the bike, it was on Metzler tyres and its original rear shocks. This, coupled with the soft front end, made for some pretty wayward handling. White lines made it weave, straight lines made it weave, cornering made it bob and weave. You can see where I'm going with this. It was a bit of a dog, and ridden hard it was hilarious. Hard cornering on a bumpy road felt like the bike was going to tie itself into one almighty knot. Now, BMW fitted a steering damper to try and tame it, but a quick twiddle of the dial pronounced this to be broken beyond help. So what did I do then? Well, I fitted new Hagon adjustable shocks on the rear, Michelin tyres and new oil for the front forks alongside a steering damper. Suddenly, the bike handled. Well, after a fashion, anyway. The Pilot Active tyres have completely cured its tendency to wander and weave over white lines and cat's eyes. I find these or Avon Road Riders are just the way to go for old bikes. Now, there are plenty of shock brands out there, and any of them would have been an improvement if you still have the originals fitted, but I like these because they have a bit of control over the damping as well as being adjustable for preload. Because they aren't sagging like the originals, the turn-in is vastly improved, as is its ability to hold cornering lines. I wish I could say I felt a difference with the front forks after changing the oil, but they feel identical to me, and I'm not tempted to mess further with them because the ride is so good I can live with that vagueness in the corners. The new steering damper, depending on where you read, is either a waste of money or completely essential. They're cheap, and I'm glad to have one which works, but the bike would be fine without one. It is quite nice to wind it up on the motorway though, as its tendency to weave at high speeds, read illegal speeds, is something which appears inherent in the chassis. Ridden quickly, it's now capable of, if you really want it to, grounding out the cylinder heads and snapping the centre stand helper off, which is the thing that your foot finds to put it down. Ask me how I know. It still weaves pushing on over bumps, leaned over, but it's no longer trying to tie itself in knots. So why then is weave inherent with these motorcycles? Well, in period, a lot was down to the tyres and suspension, but today they still do it, even with these replaced, so why? Well, there's a number of factors. Firstly, the shaft drive and swing arm arrangement is long and it flexes. Secondly, the rear axle is long, thin, and again prone to flexing in a seesaw motion between the rear mounting points. Thirdly, being a twin-shock rear end, there is a degree to which the left and right sides can move independently. Not a lot, but enough combined together to contribute. At the front end of the bike, the forks are thin and braced with cheap stamped steel. What this means is that the forks can twist ever so slightly. Now, the chassis itself is made of extremely robust steel, but this is a long motorcycle, meaning it again has a degree of flex to it. Now, it's important that a motorcycle chassis can flex, as they found out with the evil handling two-stroke GP bikes of the 90s, but on modern bikes, that is carefully controlled and designed in, not so here. Now, it's important to recognise again that these handling traits, they really don't matter very much. Modern tyres and suspension have mostly cured the issue, and you need to be riding very, very quickly before it will do truly alarming things. Fortunately, your ability to ride these bikes very quickly is limited by the cylinder head ground clearance, which, although generous, is perfectly possible to exceed. Now in the video here, I'm riding at road speeds, i.e. legal speeds, and you can clearly see the bike weave, but not to the extent that would alarm an experienced rider. For me, I write it up as part of the charm. If you want to go really quickly, then there are 1,000 better bikes to do it on, but it's interesting to explore why it does it. Now, assuming you have decent tyres and suspension, then for me, the main cause of weave can be attributed to the front forks. There are lots of relatively cheap fork braces on the market, which I have no doubt make a significant difference. It's an old bike, it's never going to handle like a modern one, and with care and a few replacement bits, it is great fun. A lot of the joy of riding a bike like this is that you can quickly get to their quite low limits. It's the complete antithesis to riding a modern 1000cc sports bike on the road. Speaking of road riding, around town it's well balanced, beautifully carbureted, and the torque is abundant. In short, it's a joy spoiled only by the grabby clutch. Because the bike doesn't vibrate hugely, the mirrors are genuinely useful, and the only impediment is filtering needs caution because you've got two great big cylinders sticking out the sides. B-roads are great. You sit high and upright, allowing you to look over hedgerows and over the tops of cars. The handling, as discussed, is not perfection itself, but the suspension does a good job of absorbing bumps, with the odd clatter from the front forks over particularly vicious ones. Faster A roads and motorways are where this bike loves to be. Its smooth power and ability to sit at anything up to city speeds make it effortless in a way which bikes of this period just so often weren't. This was an expensive bike to buy new, and it shows. Quality switchgear and the ease with which it covers miles mean you could happily tour on it today. The throttle's heavy, and you can fit lighter return springs on the carbs to lighten it, but I chose instead to fit the stay-open throttle screw which BMW had neglected to fit originally, and that's meant that I no longer have a sore right wrist on long rides. The crowds of panniers BMW supplied swallow luggage, and although the catches aren't to be trusted, the bike looks great with them fitted. Let's talk about the brakes, which I think is probably the area where this bike most falls down. I am deeply tempted to modify them, because BMW, in their infinite wisdom, ran a cable from the brake lever to a master cylinder under the petrol tank. This then passes fluid to the twin front calipers. The problem being they decided it was just too effective compared to other bikes in period, so they increased the lever efforts required to lock the front wheel. This would be fine, apart from, to lock aforementioned front wheel, you need the finger strength of a professional rock climber. Now, I thought fitting modern pants would solve it, but no such luck. How they managed to combine underpowered brakes with a complete lack of braking feel when the rest of the bike is so good is beyond me. Now, the common mod here is to fit a bar-mounted master cylinder, which I can only assume would be a vast improvement and would offer more feel and more power. So should you buy one then? If you want a classic that's easy to own, ride and service, then yes, definitely. They are reliable, they look great, and are capable of vast mileages with minimal maintenance. The flaws are inherent, but I'm not sure they matter. After all, you're not buying one of these to scuff your knee on local roundabouts. If you really want to ride a classic bike hard, then again there are better starting points. But for general road riding and touring, these really are up there with the best. I love the way it looks parked outside. I love the reassurance that it's probably going to start, and I love how relaxed it makes me feel. It's leagues better in quality than other bikes of the 1970s, and for me it would have justified the extra money in period. Now that they're somewhat undervalued compared to British bikes, I'm even more for them. Take advantage. Get a classic which works and is truly capable. You won't regret it. Thank you for listening to The Driven Wheel, and watch out in future for a twin test between this and a Triumph Trident of the period. See you again soon.